The cold in Kimbolton Castle did not belong to winter alone. It lived in the walls year-round, settling deep into the stone, into the narrow passageways, into the fabric of a place that had never truly been meant for comfort. By January, it simply became impossible to ignore. It crept into the rooms slowly, almost thoughtfully, wrapping itself around everything it touched, the bed, the table, the quiet figures moving softly in attendance. On the morning of January 7, 1536, that cold felt heavier than usual. The castle was still, but not in the peaceful way of early hours. It was the kind of stillness that comes when people are waiting without speaking of what they are waiting for. Servants moved more carefully. Doors were opened and closed with a restraint that felt almost reverent. Even footsteps seemed quieter, as if sound itself understood that something was nearing its end. In a small chamber, far removed from the grandeur she had once known, Catherine of Aragon lay propped against a stack of worn pillows. The room was modest, almost austere, its walls bare compared to the rich chambers she had once occupied as queen. A fire burned in the hearth, but its warmth struggled to reach her. The air carried the faint scent of damp stone and melted wax, a reminder of both prayer and decay. She had been many things in her life, a princess, a bride, a queen, but here, in this quiet room, there were no titles spoken aloud. Only a few attendants remained at her side, watching in silence, adjusting linens, exchanging glances that said more than words ever could. They understood what was happening, even if no one dared to name it. And yet Catherine herself seemed untouched by that quiet erasure. Her body had grown weak, her hands thinner than they once were, her breath slower and more deliberate. But there was something in her still unchanged, something that had endured not just illness, but years of isolation, humiliation, and loss. It was not strength in the visible sense, not the strength of power or command. It was quieter than that, more internal. The kind of certainty that does not ask to be recognized. Near her bed, a small table had been placed. On it rested paper, ink, and a quill. She had asked for them earlier, with a calm insistence that left no room for refusal. Even now, when so much had been taken from her, she still had something to say. When she finally reached for the quill, her hand trembled slightly, but her intention did not. For a moment she paused, looking at the blank page as if it contained not just what she would write, but everything that had come before, a life that had stretched across countries, across courts, across decades of hope and endurance. Then she began. She did not write as a discarded wife. She did not write as someone forgotten in a distant castle. She wrote as she had always understood herself to be. When the letter was finished, she signed it simply. Catherine the Queen. The title had been stripped from her years ago, denied in court, rewritten by decree, replaced with something smaller, something easier for others to accept. But here, in this final act, she claimed it again without hesitation. Not defiantly, not loudly, but with a quiet, unwavering certainty that no law had truly undone what she believed to be true. The letter was addressed to Henry VIII, the man who had once chosen her, once loved her, and eventually set her aside. There was no bitterness in her words, no accusation. Instead, there was a calmness that felt almost impossible after everything that had passed between them. She asked him to care for their daughter. She spoke of duty, of kindness, of things that still mattered to her, even now. She called him, "My most dear Lord King and husband," as if nothing had changed. As if the years of separation, the silence, the deliberate unmaking of their marriage had not reshaped her world. As if she had chosen to remain exactly where she had always stood, loyal not to circumstance, but to something deeper, something that could not be altered by decree. Outside, the day remained pale and distant. The light that filtered into the room was thin, almost hesitant, as though it too respected the quiet gravity of the moment. Somewhere far from Kimbolton, life continued, the court, the conversations, the shifting alliances. A princess who crossed the sea at 15, carrying with her not doubt, but the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly who she was meant to become. How that certainty slowly unraveled. How a life that began with such promise could end in a silent room far from everything she once knew. That is a story that does not unfold all at once. It moves slowly. Through years of waiting, of love, of loss, and of unshaken belief. And it begins not in England, but in the world that first taught her what it meant to be a queen. Long before the cold stone walls of Kimbolton Castle, before silence and separation, before England itself, there was light. Not the pale, hesitant light of an English winter, but something warmer, steadier. The kind of light that filled courtyards, reflected off white stone, and carried with it the quiet certainty of a world that believed in its own strength. Catherine of Aragon was born into that light on December 16, 1485. She was the youngest daughter of two of the most powerful rulers in Europe, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, monarchs whose marriage had reshaped Spain itself. Together, they had united kingdoms, completed the long Reconquista, and established a court defined not only by power, but by purpose. This was not a world of uncertainty. It was a world of intention. From the beginning, Catherine's life was shaped by that intention. She was not simply raised, she was prepared. Every part of her education, every lesson, every expectation placed upon her was designed with a future already in mind. She learned Latin as naturally as her native tongue. She studied history, theology, philosophy, not as ornament, but as foundation. She was taught to understand power, to navigate it, to embody it without ever needing to display it too openly. There was a quiet discipline in her upbringing, a sense that dignity was not something to be claimed later, but something to be lived from the very beginning. Her mother, Isabella, was more than a queen. She was a model. A woman who ruled in her own right, who combined piety with authority, who understood that strength did not always need to raise its voice. Catherine watched her closely, absorbing not just what she said, but how she existed in the world, steady, composed, unwavering. It was from Isabella that Catherine learned something she would carry for the rest of her life, that identity is not granted by others. It is held quietly even when the world begins to deny it. As a child, Catherine would have moved through palaces filled with movement and purpose, ambassadors arriving, decisions being made, the future of kingdoms discussed not in whispers, but in deliberate, measured tones. She grew up understanding that her life would never be entirely her own. It would belong, in part, to something larger. And yet, there was no sense of tragedy in that. Not then. Because her future, as it was imagined, was not one of loss, but of elevation. She was to be a queen. Not in Spain. That path was not hers, but elsewhere. Across the sea. In a country that, for her, existed first as an idea before it ever became a place. England. The match had been arranged early. It was more than a marriage. It was an alliance, a connection between two rising powers. Catherine was promised to Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of Henry VII of England. From that moment, her life began to tilt slowly toward a future she had never seen. She would leave Spain. She would cross the sea. She would become part of another court, another culture, another world entirely. But she would not go unprepared. Everything she was, her education, her composure, her faith, was designed to make that transition seamless. She would arrive not as a stranger, but as someone already shaped for the role she was meant to fill. And for years, that future remained distant, almost abstract. Something spoken of, planned, anticipated, but not yet real. Until, slowly, it began to draw closer. Ships would need to be prepared. Farewells would be made. A childhood, carefully constructed within the safety of Spain, would have to be left behind. There is always a moment, just before departure, when the future stops being an idea and becomes something inevitable. For Catherine, that moment came when she was still only 15. She left behind the warmth of Spain, the certainty of her mother's court, the world that had shaped her so completely, and stepped into something unknown, though she did not yet think of it that way. Because she had been taught not to fear what lay ahead, only to meet it with dignity. And so she sailed toward England not as a girl uncertain of her place, but as a princess who believed she already understood exactly who she was meant to become. And for a brief moment, when she arrived, it seemed that everything would unfold exactly as it was meant to. England did not feel like Spain. The air was heavier, cooler, touched by a dampness that lingered even in grand halls. The light was different too, softer, less certain, as though it filtered through the sky with hesitation rather than certainty. For someone raised under the clarity of the Spanish sun, it must have felt like stepping into a quieter world. But Catherine of Aragon did not hesitate. She arrived in 1501 as she had been trained to arrive, composed, dignified, already aware that she was being observed, measured, understood not just as a young girl, but as the future Queen of England. Every movement carried meaning. Every word, every gesture, contributed to the impression she would leave behind. And the impression was a good one. She was graceful without effort, educated beyond expectation, and carried with her a calm assurance that made her seem older than her 15 years. The English court, cautious by nature, received her with approval. She was, in many ways, exactly what had been promised. Her marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, was celebrated with all the ceremony such an alliance required. They were both young, both 15, and yet the weight of the moment extended far beyond them. This was not simply a union of two individuals, but of two kingdoms, two futures being carefully aligned. For a brief time, everything appeared as it should. They were sent to live in Ludlow Castle, far from the center of court life, where they would begin their married life together. It was a symbolic step, the beginning of their independence, their transition into the roles they were meant to grow into. There is a softness to such beginnings, even when they are arranged. A sense of possibility, of something just starting to take shape. Catherine, raised to fulfill this exact role, stepped into it with quiet confidence. She had arrived where she was meant to be. But that sense of stability did not last. Within months, illness moved through the household at Ludlow. It came without warning, as such things often do, and spread quickly in the close quarters of castle life. There were no clear explanations, no reliable treatments, only uncertainty, and the slow realization that something was wrong. Arthur fell ill. At first, it may not have seemed serious. Illness was common, especially in colder climates, especially among those still so young. But this was different. His condition worsened quickly, beyond what anyone expected, beyond what anyone could control. Catherine fell ill as well. For a time, they were both sick, two young figures, newly married, isolated in a castle that now felt far more distant than it had before. Whatever future had been imagined for them, it had not included this. Catherine survived. Arthur did not. He died in April 1502, less than 5 months after their marriage. And just like that, everything changed. The role she had been prepared for, the future she had crossed the sea to claim, disappeared almost overnight. She was no longer the wife of the heir. No longer the future queen. Instead, she became something far more uncertain, a widow in a foreign land, her place suddenly undefined. She was still only 16. There are moments in life when the path forward simply disappears, leaving behind nothing but questions. For Catherine, this was one of them. The careful structure of her upbringing had prepared her for many things, for power, for duty, for responsibility, but not for this sudden absence of direction. And yet, even here, something within her remained unchanged. She did not collapse into uncertainty. She did not lose the composure that had been instilled in her since childhood. Instead, she waited. Because in a world shaped by alliances and decisions made far above her, waiting was not weakness. It was necessity. Her fate was no longer her own to move forward. It would be decided elsewhere, in negotiations, in letters, in the careful calculations of kings and queens. And so she remained in England. Not as a bride. Not as a queen. But as something in between. Uncertain, yet still carrying within her the quiet belief that her story here was not over. And in the years that followed, that belief would be tested more than anything she had yet endured. After the death of Arthur, Prince of Wales, time did not move forward for Catherine of Aragon in the way it once had. Instead, it seemed to pause. Not completely. The world around her continued, decisions were made, courts shifted, alliances adjusted. But for Catherine herself, everything narrowed into something quieter, more uncertain. The future that had once been clearly outlined for her had dissolved, and in its place there was only waiting. At first, that waiting carried a kind of fragile hope. There was still a possibility, discussed carefully, negotiated slowly, that she might marry Arthur's younger brother, Henry VIII, though at the time he was only a boy. The idea made sense politically. It would preserve the alliance between England and Spain, protect the investment that had already been made, and allow Catherine to remain within the role she had been brought here to fulfill. But nothing happened quickly. And as the months stretched into years, hope began to thin. Henry VII of England, cautious and deeply concerned with finances, refused to return Catherine's dowry in full. At the same time, he hesitated to finalize a new marriage arrangement. She was, in a sense, too valuable to send away, but not valuable enough to secure immediately. And so she remained. Not quite a princess. Not quite a widow in the traditional sense. Not yet a bride again. Something undefined. Her household was reduced. Her finances became strained. Letters were sent back to Spain, careful, restrained at first, then increasingly urgent. She described her situation, though never without dignity, never without control. Even in difficulty, she understood the importance of perception. But reality pressed in quietly. There were times when she lacked proper clothing for the English climate. Times when her attendance went unpaid. Times when her position at court felt less like an honored guest and more like a forgotten obligation. It is easy to imagine this period as purely political, as a matter of delayed negotiations and cautious strategy. But for Catherine, it was something far more personal. She was alone. Far from her mother, who had always been her anchor. Far from the world that had defined her identity. Surrounded by a court that, while polite, did not fully belong to her. And yet she did not return to Spain. She could have insisted more strongly. She could have demanded resolution. But doing so would have meant abandoning the possibility, however uncertain, that she might still become Queen of England. And so she chose to stay. To endure. To wait. Years passed this way, not marked by major events, but by small, quiet acts of persistence. By letters written and rewritten. By hopes adjusted but never entirely abandoned. By a steady refusal to let her identity slip into something lesser, even when circumstances suggested it might. During this time, something in Catherine deepened. The confidence of her youth did not disappear, but it changed shape. It became less about expectation and more about endurance. Less about the certainty of what would happen, and more about the determination to remain who she was, regardless of what did not. When news came from Spain, it carried both comfort and loss. Her mother, Isabella I of Castile, remained a distant but powerful presence, a reminder of where she had come from, of the strength she had been taught to embody. But distance is its own kind of silence, and even that connection could not fully bridge the life she had left behind. 7 years. 7 years of waiting in a foreign country, with a future that refused to settle into certainty. And yet she remained. Because somewhere beneath the uncertainty, there was still a belief, quiet, persistent, that she had not come to England for nothing. That her story here, however delayed, was not finished. And in 1509, that long pause finally began to move again. When Henry VII of England died in April 1509, the stillness that had defined Catherine's life for years was broken almost immediately. His son, Henry VIII, became king at just 17. And with that single shift, everything changed. Where his father had been cautious, restrained, and calculating, the young Henry was something entirely different. He was confident, energetic, eager to define his reign not by hesitation, but by action. He moved quickly, decisively, and one of his first decisions was Catherine. Within weeks, he chose to marry her. Not reluctantly. Not as a delayed obligation. But openly, willingly, as if correcting a long-standing imbalance that had never quite made sense to him. Catherine, who had spent 7 years waiting in uncertainty, suddenly found herself at the center of the future she had once only hoped for. The marriage took place in June 1509. It was not simply a resolution of political tension. It felt, to many, like a beginning. Henry admired her. That much was clear. She was older than him by several years, but her composure, her intelligence, and the quiet authority she carried made that difference seem irrelevant. She was everything a queen was expected to be, and perhaps more importantly, everything he believed he wanted beside him. Their coronation followed soon after, a ceremony marked by grandeur and public celebration. London responded with enthusiasm. The young king was charismatic, full of promise, and Catherine, graceful, dignified, already familiar to the people, completed the image perfectly. Together, they looked like certainty. For Catherine, the transformation was almost unimaginable. From years of waiting, of financial strain, of quiet marginalization, to the full recognition of her place as Queen of England. The title she had been prepared for since childhood was finally hers, not as a distant possibility, but as a lived reality. And she stepped into it without hesitation. She fulfilled her role with a natural ease that came not from imitation, but from preparation. This was what she had been shaped for, not just to wear a crown, but to embody what it represented. She was devout, attentive, measured in her actions, and deeply aware of the expectations placed upon her. The people admired her. The court respected her. And Henry, at least in these early years, valued her. There are moments in history that feel almost suspended in perfection, as though nothing could disturb them. This was one of those moments. A young king and his queen, united not only by alliance, but by what appeared to be genuine harmony. A kingdom looking forward rather than back. For a time, it seemed that everything Catherine had endured had led precisely here. That the years of waiting had not been wasted, but simply delayed. That the uncertainty had resolved itself into something stable, something lasting. But even within that sense of fulfillment, there were expectations that remained unspoken, yet deeply understood. A queen must do more than reign beside a king. She must secure the future. And for Catherine, that future had a very specific shape. A son. At first, there was no reason to doubt that it would come. She was still strong, still capable, still fully within the years expected of motherhood. The court anticipated it. The kingdom assumed it. Henry himself believed it. And Catherine, who had waited so long for this life, carried that expectation with quiet determination. Because becoming queen had been the fulfillment of her destiny. But remaining queen would depend on something far more fragile. In the early years of their marriage, there was no visible shadow over the union of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. If anything, their life together seemed to confirm what so many had hoped for. They were well matched in ways that went beyond politics. Henry admired Catherine not only as his queen, but as a partner he could trust. She was steady where he was impulsive, thoughtful where he was restless. And in those differences there was a kind of balance that, for a time, felt secure. He listened to her. That detail, small as it may seem, mattered more than it appeared. Catherine was not a silent figure beside the throne. She was involved, attentive, capable of understanding matters of governance with a clarity that came from her upbringing. When Henry left England to campaign in France, he entrusted her with the role of regent, not as a formality, but as a genuine responsibility. And she fulfilled it. During his absence, she oversaw the kingdom with composure and discipline. Decisions were made calmly, without spectacle. And when the threat from Scotland emerged, it was under her regency that English forces moved to meet it. The victory at the Battle of Flodden became one of the defining moments of that period, and though Catherine was not on the battlefield, her presence was felt in the authority that guided the response. She even wrote to Henry afterward, informing him of the victory with a tone that was both respectful and quietly proud. There was no need for exaggeration. The facts spoke clearly enough. In these years, she was not only queen in title. She was queen in function. And Henry, for a time, seemed to recognize that fully. Their court reflected this harmony. There were celebrations, tournaments, displays of wealth and vitality that reinforced the image of a strong and unified monarchy. Catherine moved through this world with ease, her dignity never forced, her presence never uncertain. She was admired not for spectacle, but for consistency, for the sense that she remained entirely herself, regardless of circumstance. And yet, beneath that stability, something more fragile was quietly unfolding. Pregnancies came. And with them, hope. Each one carried the same expectation, that this time, the future would take the shape it was meant to. That this time, the long-awaited son would be born, securing not only the dynasty, but Catherine's place within it. At first, there was no reason to doubt it. But hope, when repeated too many times without fulfillment, begins to change. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. And in Catherine's life, that change would not come all at once, but through a series of losses that would reshape everything. Between 1510 and 1516, Catherine of Aragon experienced what many women of her time did, pregnancies that did not end as hoped. But for a queen, such losses were never only personal. They were political. Each pregnancy began with anticipation that extended far beyond the private chambers of the court. The entire kingdom, in its quiet way, waited alongside her. A son was not simply a child. He was stability, continuity, the answer to a question that hovered constantly over the Tudor dynasty. The first time, there was joy. In 1510, Catherine gave birth to a son. For a brief moment, everything seemed to align. The long-awaited heir had arrived, and with him, the promise that the future was secure. But the promise did not last. The child lived only a short time, just weeks, perhaps months, before he died. The loss, though not uncommon in that era, carried a weight that extended beyond grief. It was the loss of certainty, the quiet return of doubt. And yet there was still hope. Another pregnancy followed. Then another. But this time, the outcomes were harsher. A stillborn son. Another child who did not survive. Loss, repeated often enough, begins to reshape expectation. What was once assumed becomes uncertain. What was once anticipated becomes something fragile, something that cannot be held too firmly for fear it will disappear again. For Catherine, each loss was deeply personal, though she carried it with the same composure she had always shown. There were no public displays of despair, no visible collapse under the weight of what she endured. Instead, there was endurance, quiet, steady, almost invisible to those who did not look closely. But Henry was watching. At first, he remained patient. He reassured her, as kings are expected to do, that time remained, that there would be other children, other chances. And perhaps he believed it. But patience, like hope, has its limits. By the time Catherine became pregnant again in 1516, the atmosphere had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily named, but subtly, in the way expectations become more cautious after disappointment. When the child was born, it was a girl. Mary the First of England. She was healthy. She survived. And in that sense, she was everything Catherine had been hoping for, a child who would live, who would grow, who would carry forward something of her. But she was not a son. Henry concealed his disappointment well enough. He spoke the expected words, that they were still young, that more children would come, that this was not the end of hope. And outwardly, nothing seemed broken. But something had shifted. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Catherine was 31. She had endured multiple pregnancies, multiple losses. Her body, though still strong, had been tested in ways that left traces no one could fully see. And though no one said it aloud, the question had begun to take shape. What if there would be no son? For now, it remained unspoken. The court continued as before. The image of stability was maintained. Catherine remained queen, respected, composed, unwavering in her role. But beneath that surface, something new had entered their story. Not conflict. Not yet. Just the quiet beginning of doubt. The kind that does not announce itself, but slowly changes everything that follows. By the winter of 1516, the rhythm of hope and loss had already shaped the life of Catherine of Aragon in ways that could not be undone. And yet, when she became pregnant again, hope returned, not as brightly as before, not as certain, but still present. It came quietly, carefully, as if even expectation itself had learned to move more gently. The court waited. Not with celebration this time, but with restraint. Too much had already been lost to allow for unguarded joy. And Catherine herself seemed to understand this. She carried the pregnancy not with outward excitement, but with a kind of inward focus, as though everything depended not on anticipation, but on endurance. When the child was born in February, the room must have held its breath for a moment. The child lived. She was strong. She cried. And in that cry, there was something Catherine had not heard in too long, certainty that life, at least this time, would continue. The child was a girl. Mary the First of England. For Catherine, that may have been enough. After so many losses, survival itself carried its own kind of meaning. This was not just another child. This was a daughter who would grow, who would remain, who would not disappear into memory after weeks or months. A living presence, something she could hold on to, something real. But for Henry VIII, the moment was more complicated. Outwardly, he responded as expected. He acknowledged the child, ensured she was recognized, allowed the court to celebrate in the measured way it had learned to adopt. He said what needed to be said, that they were still young, that sons would follow, that this was not the end of hope. And perhaps, at that moment, he believed it. But belief had already begun to shift. A daughter could not secure the dynasty in the same way. Not in the world they lived in, where stability depended on a male heir, where uncertainty could grow into conflict if succession was not clearly defined. And so Mary's birth became something both joyful and insufficient. Catherine, now 31, had given Henry a living child, something she had longed to do, something she had fought for through years of loss. And yet, even in that success, there was an absence that could not be ignored. No son. Still, time, which had once felt expansive, began to narrow. Pregnancies did not come as easily as before. Her body, marked by what it had endured, no longer moved with the same certainty. The possibility remained, but it no longer felt inevitable. And though nothing changed immediately, not in title, not in position, not in the visible structure of their lives, something quieter had begun to settle into place. An awareness. A question that lingered just beneath the surface of everything. What if this was all there would be? Catherine did not voice it. She continued as she always had, composed, devoted, unwavering in her role as queen and mother. She raised Mary with care, with intention, passing on the same discipline and faith that had shaped her own life. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. But the balance that had once felt so natural was no longer effortless. It required maintenance. And in time, even that would no longer be enough. Because somewhere beyond the quiet walls of certainty, something new was beginning to take form. Not through loss this time, but through desire. By the mid-1520s, the court of Henry VIII had settled into a familiar rhythm. It was a world of ceremony and repetition, of expectations that had long since become routine. Catherine of Aragon remained at its center, respected, dignified, still embodying everything a queen was meant to be. Her presence did not demand attention, it commanded it quietly, through consistency rather than display. But time does not stand still, even in courts that seem unchanging. New faces arrived. Younger ones? Among them was Anne Boleyn. She did not enter the court dramatically. There was no single moment that marked her arrival as significant. At first, she was simply part of the Queen's household, one of many ladies, moving through the same spaces, observing the same rituals, existing within the same carefully ordered world. But Anne was not easily absorbed into that order. She had spent years in the courts of Europe, in France, in particular, where refinement took a different form. She was quick in thought, sharp in conversation, and carried herself with a confidence that did not rely on tradition. There was something about her that resisted quiet placement. Something that did not simply fit into the existing structure, but shifted it, subtly, just by being present. Henry noticed. At first, perhaps, it was curiosity. And was different from the women he had known. Not softer, not more yielding, but more distant, more controlled in a way that created intrigue rather than comfort. She did not offer immediate admiration. She did not move toward him in the expected way. And that distance changed everything. Because what is easily given is often easily forgotten. What resists lingers. Henry's attention, once steady and predictable, began to turn. Not suddenly, not in a way that disrupted the court overnight, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. Conversations lasted longer. Glances held just a moment too long. The familiar patterns of behavior began to shift, though no one could yet fully define how. And did not become his mistress. That, more than anything, set her apart. She refused. Whether from conviction, ambition, or a clear understanding of her own value, she did not accept a place that had been occupied by others before her. She did not settle into the role of a passing interest. Instead, she held her position, just out of reach, just beyond certainty. And in doing so, she changed the terms entirely. For Henry, this was no longer a distraction. It became something else. Something deeper. More consuming. More dangerous. Because desire, when denied, does not fade. It sharpens. And for the first time in many years, the life he had built, the marriage that had once felt stable, the queen who had always stood beside him, began to feel insufficient. Not because Catherine had changed, but because his expectations had. Catherine, watching from within that same world, could not have failed to notice the shift. She understood courts. She understood people. And more than that, she understood her husband. Something was different. Not openly. Not yet. But enough to be felt. Enough to create a quiet, growing distance that could not be easily named, but could no longer be ignored. And unlike the losses she had endured before, this was not something she could survive through patience alone. Because this time, the threat was not absence, but replacement. By 1527, what had once been only a subtle shift in the court of Henry VIII had become something impossible to ignore. It was no longer a matter of passing attention or quiet fascination. His interest in Anne Boleyn had deepened into something far more consuming, something that began to reshape not only his personal life, but the structure of the kingdom itself. What had once been contained within glances and conversations now demanded resolution. And that resolution required one thing above all else: freedom. Henry began to speak, at first cautiously and then with growing conviction, of the possibility that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had never been valid. The argument was not new in its essence, but it had never been pursued with such urgency. He claimed that because Catherine had been the wife of his brother, the marriage stood in violation of divine law, that it had been flawed from the beginning, and that their failure to produce a surviving son was not misfortune, but judgment. It was a narrative that allowed him to transform desire into duty. Not a king seeking to set aside his wife, but a man attempting to correct a wrong that had angered God. For Catherine, the claim was not only political. It was deeply personal. She denied it completely. From the beginning, she maintained with unwavering certainty that her marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, had never been consummated. That truth, as she insisted upon it, was not simply a detail. It was the foundation of everything that followed. If it held, then her marriage to Henry was valid, lawful, unbreakable. And she would not yield. What followed became known as the King's Great Matter, years of legal argument, diplomatic pressure, and in that moment, the conflict ceased to be something that could be resolved quietly. It became a division. Not only between husband and wife, but between two visions of truth that could no longer coexist. By 1531, the long struggle had reached a point where patience could no longer sustain it. Henry VIII had waited for a decision that never came, pressed for an outcome that remained just out of reach, and endured a resistance from Catherine of Aragon that had never weakened. What had once been negotiation hardened into action. He removed her from court. It was not done with open cruelty. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public declarations of banishment. Instead, it happened in the quiet, controlled manner that often defines the most decisive moments. Catherine was instructed to leave the court and take up residence elsewhere. The effect, however, was unmistakable. She was being set aside. At first, she may have believed it temporary, another phase in a conflict that had already stretched for years. But as time passed, it became clear that this was something different. She was not being repositioned. She was being erased. Her household was reduced further. The number of attendants allowed to remain with her diminished. The spaces she occupied became smaller, less comfortable, increasingly distant from the life she had once known. She was moved from one residence to another, each one more isolated than the last, each one reinforcing the same quiet message. You no longer belong at the center. But the most devastating separation was not from court. It was from her daughter. Mary I of England was taken from her. Not abruptly, not in a way that would create open scandal, but deliberately, with the same controlled precision that defined everything else. Access was restricted, then denied. Letters were monitored, intercepted, sometimes never delivered at all. For Catherine, who had endured years of uncertainty, loss, and humiliation, this was something deeper. This was absence that could not be endured through patience. She wrote to Henry. Not once, but many times. Her letters were not filled with anger. They did not accuse or condemn. Instead, they carried the same tone she had always used, respectful, composed, unwavering in its dignity. She asked only for what, to her, was reasonable. To see her daughter. To maintain the bond that had become the most meaningful part of her life. But her words did not change his course. Responses, when they came, were distant, formal, shaped more by decision than by feeling. And often, there was no response at all. Silence became its own answer. In the places where she was sent, cold, damp residences far from the movement of court, Catherine's world grew smaller. The rhythm of her days shifted from public duty to private endurance. Prayer became central. Routine became a way to hold structure where so much had been removed. And yet, even here, she did not accept the identity imposed upon her. She continued to sign her letters as Queen. She continued to refer to herself not as a widow, not as something diminished, but as what she believed she still was. That quiet refusal became the last form of resistance available to her. Because everything else had been taken gradually, carefully, in ways that left no single moment to oppose. But identity, that remained hers. Even as the distance between her and the world she once inhabited became almost complete, she held to it with the same steadiness she had learned as a child. And far away, beyond the walls that now contained her, Henry's life was already moving forward. Toward a decision he would soon make irreversible. Toward a future in which Catherine would no longer have any place at all. And the final step in that transformation would come not through debate, but through action that would change England forever. By 1533, the long uncertainty had come to an end, not because it had been resolved, but because Henry VIII had decided that resolution was no longer necessary. What he could not obtain through permission, he would create through action. His relationship with Anne Boleyn had already passed the point of quiet attachment. It had become central to his vision of the future, not only personal, but dynastic. And was no longer simply desired, she was necessary to the outcome he now believed in completely. And so, without waiting for Rome, without waiting for judgment that might never come, Henry married her in secret. The ceremony was private, almost quiet in its execution, but its meaning was anything but small. It was not simply a marriage. It was a declaration that the years of waiting, of negotiation, of restraint had ended. Soon after, the marriage to Catherine of Aragon was declared invalid by a court that now operated under Henry's authority rather than the Pope's. With that decision, everything was formally rewritten. Catherine was no longer queen. She was given a new title, Dowager Princess of Wales, defined not by her life with Henry, but by her brief, long-past marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales. It was a deliberate reduction, a way of placing her firmly in the past, of removing her from the present entirely. But Catherine did not accept it. She never used the title. Not once. In her letters, in her words, in the way she understood herself, she remained what she had always been. Queen. Wife. The woman who had stood beside Henry for 20 years, who had shared his life, his court, his ambitions. No decree could undo that in her mind. Meanwhile, and was crowned. The ceremony was magnificent, designed to affirm what had already been decided. The court adjusted, as courts always do. Allegiances shifted. Titles were reassigned. What had once seemed impossible became, gradually, the new order. And yet, even within that transformation, there was an undercurrent of unease. Because Catherine still lived. She had not disappeared. She had not withdrawn into silence. She remained distant but present, refusing to acknowledge the reality that had been constructed around her. For Henry, this created something difficult to resolve. He had moved forward. But the past had not released him. Catherine's existence, quiet, unwavering, immovable, stood as a contradiction to everything he had declared. As long as she lived, the narrative remained incomplete. And so, while the world adjusted to a new queen, Catherine remained in the margins, holding on to a truth that no one in power was willing to recognize. Her world, however, had grown even smaller. The distance between her and her daughter, Mary I of England, was no longer only physical. It was enforced. Because accepting Anne as queen required something more than Catherine's removal. It required Mary's compliance. And that, too, would be demanded. Separation, when it first began, had been something Catherine of Aragon believed she could endure. She had endured distance before, from Spain, from her family, from the life she had once known. She understood absence, understood how to carry it without allowing it to break her. But this was different. This was her daughter. Mary I of England was not simply someone she loved. She was the last living thread that connected Catherine to everything she had built in England, to her marriage, her role, her purpose. In Mary, her life had continued in a way that loss had not been able to take from her. And now, that connection was being controlled. Letters became the only way to reach her. Catherine wrote carefully, deliberately, knowing that her words might never arrive, or might be read by others before they did. She could not write freely, and yet she wrote with a clarity that did not require openness to be understood. Her letters carried guidance more than grief. She reminded Mary of who she was. Not as others were beginning to define her, but as Catherine believed her to be, a princess, the rightful daughter of a king and queen. She urged her to remain steadfast, to hold to her faith, to resist pressure that might force her to deny her own identity. There is a quiet strength in such writing. Not dramatic, not desperate, but persistent. She did not tell Mary to fight openly. She did not fill her words with anger toward Henry or Anne. Instead, she focused on something deeper, the preservation of self in a world that was trying to reshape it. Mary, still young, was placed under increasing pressure. She was expected to acknowledge Anne as queen, to accept her own redefinition, from princess to something lesser, something dependent on the new order. Compliance would have made her life easier. It would have restored comfort, position, security. But it would have required something Catherine could not accept. And so, through letters that were sometimes delayed, sometimes intercepted, sometimes never delivered at all, Catherine continued to reach for her daughter. Not physically, but through words. Each letter was an act of connection, a refusal to allow the distance to become final. Even when she did not know if Mary would read them, she wrote as if she would. As if the act itself mattered, regardless of the outcome. In her isolation, this became one of the few things that remained entirely hers. Not her title. not her place, but her voice. And through it, she continued to shape the one future she still believed in, not her own, but Mary's. Because by now, Catherine no longer fought for restoration. She fought for continuity. For the idea that what had been true could not be entirely erased. And somewhere beyond the walls that confined her, that idea was still alive, fragile, contested, but not yet broken. By the beginning of 1536, the world that Henry VIII had reshaped with such determination began, quietly, to shift again. What had once seemed fixed, his devotion to Anne Boleyn, the certainty of his choice, the future he had built around her, no longer felt as stable as it had. There were no immediate signs visible from afar, no single moment that announced a change. But within the court, something had begun to unravel, and had not given him what he most desired. She, too, had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, and like Catherine of Aragon before her, she had not secured the male heir that Henry believed necessary. Time, once again, became a quiet pressure. Expectations, once again, remained unmet. And where Catherine had responded with endurance, and responded differently, she was sharper, less willing to accept silence, less inclined to disappear into the background of Henry's will. What had once drawn him to her, her resistance, her independence, now began to create friction. The same qualities that had once made her irresistible no longer fit easily into the shape of what he now wanted. At court, whispers began. Not loudly. Not all at once. But in the careful, controlled way such things always begin, through suggestion rather than accusation, through implication rather than statement. Conversations shifted. Glances carried meaning. And gradually, a narrative began to form. And was accused. The charges were severe: adultery, treason, betrayal of the king himself. Whether believed or constructed, they moved quickly from rumor to formal accusation, and from accusation to action. In a matter of weeks, what had once been unthinkable became inevitable. She was arrested. Taken to the Tower of London, a place that had seen many endings, but rarely one so swift, so complete. The court adjusted once more, as it always did. Those who had supported her stepped back. Those who had watched quietly now spoke with certainty. And the story changed. For Catherine, far from court, this transformation arrived only as distant knowledge. She was already ill by this time, her body weakened by years of hardship, her world reduced to the narrow confines of her residence. The news of Anne's arrest may have reached her, or perhaps only fragments of it did. But whatever she knew, it came too late to matter. There was no triumph in it. No sense of resolution. Because by then, Catherine was no longer living within the same world where such events carried meaning. The conflict that had once defined her life had already moved beyond her reach. The woman who had replaced her was falling. But Catherine would not live to see the end of that fall. And in that quiet distance, there was something almost inevitable, as though the cycle that had once displaced her was simply continuing, moving forward without pause, without reflection. The world that had removed her did not stop. It only changed direction. And as it did, Catherine herself was nearing the end of her own story, not in the noise of court, but in silence. By December 1535, Catherine of Aragon was already dying. The illness had come gradually, without a single defining moment. Weakness settled into her body in the same quiet way that so much else had entered her life, slowly, persistently, without drama. By the time it became undeniable, there was little left to be done. She remained at Kimbolton Castle, the same cold residence that had come to define her final years. The rooms were still damp. The air still carried that familiar chill. But now, the space felt even smaller, as though the world itself had begun to close in around her. She was confined to her bed. The routines that had once structured her days, prayer, writing, small acts of order, became more difficult to maintain. Even sitting upright required effort. Even speaking came slowly, each word measured not by intention, but by strength. And yet, there was no visible surrender. Those who remained with her would later describe not despair, but calm. Not resignation, but a kind of steady awareness. She seemed to understand what was coming, and to accept it not as defeat, but as something that no longer required resistance. There is a particular stillness that comes at the end of a long struggle. Not because the struggle has been won, but because it no longer needs to continue. In those final weeks, Catherine turned her attention to what remained within her control. She prayed. She reflected. And eventually she prepared to write one last time. The letter to Henry VIII was not written in anger. It did not attempt to revisit the past or challenge the decisions that had led her here. Instead, it carried the same tone that had defined her throughout everything, measured, composed, unwavering in its dignity. She forgave him. Or at least, she chose to write as though forgiveness was possible. She asked him to care for their daughter, Mary I of England. She spoke of her not with fear, but with quiet hope, as though even now, she believed that something of their shared past might still guide his actions. And at the end, she signed the letter as she always had. Catherine the Queen. Not because the world recognized it, but because she did. In that act, small as it may seem, everything remained intact. Her identity had not been rewritten. Her place in her own story had not been diminished. Even here, at the edge of her life, in a cold room far from everything she had once known, she remained exactly who she had always believed herself to be. And as the days grew shorter, and her strength continued to fade, the distance between past and present seemed to dissolve. There was no longer a court. No longer a conflict. Only memory. And the quiet approach of an ending that would come not with ceremony, but with the same stillness that had followed her for years. On January 7, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle, the day unfolded quietly. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic turn that marked the exact moment when life began to slip away from Catherine of Aragon. Instead, it happened as so much else in her final years had happened, gradually, almost gently, as though the world itself were easing its hold. By the early afternoon, her breathing had become faint. Each breath spaced slightly further apart than the last, each one requiring more effort than the one before it. The room remained still. Those attending her moved only when necessary, speaking in low voices, aware that sound no longer belonged fully to that space. There was no court to witness this moment. No ceremony. No recognition from the world she had once been part of. And yet there was something complete about it. Her life, which had once stretched across kingdoms and expectations, had narrowed over the years into something much quieter, but not smaller. What remained at the end was not what had been taken from her, but what had endured through everything. Her faith. Not in a way that demanded attention, but completely. The woman who had once arrived in England as its most celebrated bride, who had ruled beside a king, who had endured years of loss and separation without relinquishing her identity, was gone. And yet, even in death, the question remained, not of what she had lost, but of what she had preserved. Because there are lives that are defined by change. And there are lives that are defined by what does not change, even when everything else is taken away. Catherine's was the latter. And in that quiet constancy, there was something that would outlast the circumstances that had tried to erase her. After her death, the world did not pause. Henry VIII did not come to Kimbolton Castle. There was no royal procession waiting to carry her with the honors she had once been entitled to. The distance that had defined her final years remained, even now. Arrangements were made efficiently, without ceremony beyond what was considered necessary. She would be buried at Peterborough Cathedral. Not as queen, but as the widow of Arthur, Prince of Wales. The title, imposed upon her in life, followed her into death. It was the final attempt to redefine her, to place her within a narrative that no longer acknowledged the years she had spent as Henry's wife, as England's queen. And yet, even here, the reality was more complex than the official record. People came. Not because they were required to, but because they chose to. Those who had known her, those who had served her, and even those who had only watched from a distance gathered to pay their respects. There was no grandeur, no display meant to impress. Only a quiet acknowledgment of a woman who had remained constant when so much around her had changed. She had been loved. That, perhaps, was the part that could not be rewritten. Her daughter, Mary I of England, was not permitted to attend. The separation that had defined Catherine's final years extended even to this moment. There would be no farewell between them, no final act of connection to close what had been forced apart. And so the burial passed in the same quiet manner that had come to define the end of her life. Without spectacle. Without recognition from the power that had once surrounded her. But not without meaning. Because titles, once removed, can be reassigned. Ceremonies can be altered. Records can be rewritten. But memory moves differently. It lingers. It settles into places where authority does not reach. And in that way, Catherine's story did not end at Peterborough. It simply moved beyond the control of those who had tried to define it. Carried not by decree, but by those who remembered who she had been. Years passed after Catherine's death, and the world continued to turn. Mary I of England grew into a woman shaped by absence, by letters she sometimes never received, and by the lessons her mother had embedded in her heart. Even in exile and separation, Catherine had taught her what it meant to remain steadfast, to carry dignity when the world tries to strip it away, to believe in the truth of who she was. When Mary ascended the throne in 1553, she took more than the crown. She restored her mother's legacy. The title of Queen, which had been denied to Catherine in life and misrepresented in death, was returned. On her mother's tomb in Peterborough Cathedral, the inscription now read, Catherine, Queen of England. The recognition that had been withheld during her life was finally made real. For Mary, it was not only a political act. It was deeply personal, an act of love, remembrance, and justice. She honored her mother not just as the woman who had given her life, but as the queen who had endured betrayal, loss, and exile without ever surrendering her identity. Catherine had waited 20 years to become queen. She had reigned for 20 years. And in the last 5 years of her life, nearly everything had been taken from her: her title, her husband's favor, even her daughter. Yet what could not be taken was her selfhood, her courage, and the imprint she left on those who survived her. And finally, through her daughter, she was remembered exactly as she had always believed herself to be, Catherine, the Queen. She waited 20 years to be Queen. Then 20 years she ruled. And in the final years, all was taken from her. But the daughter she had fought for returned her name. The story of a woman who never broke.